Okay, so good morning, everybody. We were talking about tax evasion and whether it's permitted in according to halacha. So we began Sif Tesvav with an unequivocal statement from the Rav Shulchan Aruch telling us that tax evasion, um, when the tax collector is collecting a legitimate, reasonable, I shouldn't even say reasonable because that's very subjective. I want to use more accurate language. When the tax collector is collecting on behalf of the king or on behalf of the government, it makes no difference whether the tax collector is Jewish or non-Jewish, as long as it's a fixed amount and he is charging the same based upon an index, a tax index, as far as how much people have to pay, then it is a person's halachic obligation to pay the taxes. Midi oraisa, biblically, it's a biblical obligation. And anyone who does not pay the taxes and evades the tax is committing an act of gezela. Now, why is it gezela? If there's a principle called hafkas halva. Now, this is something that we've touched upon in the past, that where he talked about this in the parentheses. Sha'av shemutra lahafkia chovo shechayev lenachri mikavar. He says, because even though there is a halachic position that if a person has a debt with a non-Jew, then it is permissible at times when there's no chilul Hashem to figure out a way to get out of paying that debt. And as the Imrei Yaakov says, this was explained back in Sif Daled. Let me just see if I have a Sif Daled easily accessible over here. See if I go back. How far back did we go? No, I have to go back to the previous packet. Just give me 1 second. Okay. If we take a look at this, can everyone see the? Can everyone? Let me just see. Are you able to see where it says Siman Zion Sif Daled? Are you able to see my screen? Okay. The halacha over here was Asr Lashuk is Chaver Afilu Kolshu. You're not allowed to financially oppress your brother or your fellow Jew. And what is the definition of oppression? Zeh haba mamon chaver liyado biratzon habalim. That's when you have money that belongs to somebody else in your possession. You didn't steal it. Somebody, let's say, lent it to you or provided you with a service or a good that creates an obligation for you to pay. And ve'eno rotza l'shalim, and you don't want to pay. Okay, so in that situation, you have a Torah obligation of paying back your debt, but it's not considered to be stealing. What it is that if you don't pay a person when you're supposed to pay him what you owe him, you're in violation of lo ta'ashok et re'acha. You shall not oppress your fellow. Okay? V'lav ze'eno ela b'Yisrael avalo b'nachri shene'emar re'acha. This prohibition does not apply to a non-Jew because the Torah only says you may not oppress your fellow, which applies only to a Jew. However, he says, so again, there's the prohibition of stealing, which is where you proactively take something that's not yours and you take it for yourself without paying for it. And then there's the biblical prohibition that only applies to your fellow Jew, which is if your friend or gives you something with the expectation for you to pay back, and you fail to pay back, so then you're in violation of lo ta'ashok. It's not gezela or geneva because it came into your hands legally with consent and without any acrimony. Okay, but he says, "V'hu she'ein chilul Hashem b'davar," but that's provided that there's no chilul Hashem created by your failure to pay back what you owe. That's when we say that there's no prohibition. But there are many. But in most situations, there will be a chilul Hashem. Kagon shalava minachri umeis anachri, and with the example that we gave is where you borrowed money from a Gentile and then he died, and no one, not even his heirs, are aware that you owe the money. Now, your conscience may bother you, and you may feel duty bound to do the right thing, but halachically, there is not the same level of obligation to pay back as if it was your fellow Jew. Okay, so we saw this as a disturbing double standard, but nonetheless, this exists in the book, in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, all right. So that's what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is making reference to over here, where he says that even though there is this distinction in halacha, and I'm going back now to where we are over here. Just give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay. Okay. He says, so af shamutra lahafkia chovo. I hope everyone can see me. Yell out if you can't see. Even though it is permitted to absolve yourself, to evade your obligation, shechayev l'nachri mikavar, ze'eno kimafkia chova. But over here, when it comes to tax obligations, it is not the same thing as just failing to pay back. Why? Because elagozel mamish, but you're actually stealing. And the reason is shenehene me'artzo shalomi daita. It's because every given moment you are benefiting from the land and from the services of the government, which without paying, without the king's consent, without the government's consent, because the government only consents to people to benefit from its land and its services so long as you are paying your taxes. But if you don't pay your taxes, so then you're committing an act of thievery, because you're taking goods, you're taking services from the government without paying for them. Umechasro mamon, and you're causing the government a financial loss. Shaharei haya yachol limkor hana'azu shel masu matan ba'artzo li'ishacher, because the government could have given the rights of, let's say, for example, a license for you to sell goods, which the government grants a limited number limited number of these things to the different merchants, with the expectation that you're going to pay the tax. Or let's say, medical services like we have in a modern society. The government covers your medical needs, but that's out of pocket expense of the government. So the government expects everyone to pay back, right? Va'od shahamelech muchzaku bamesh shemagia lo me'avadav hol v'hiskimu lav b'nei osa haaretz. And furthermore, the king or the government is considered to be the possessor of all that reaches his subjects, because this is the convention of that land. B'samcha daitem shuhu adoneim v'heim avodim lo. And there is already a consensus of all of the citizens of that country that the king or the government is their, it has dominion over them, and they are subservient to that government. And everything, therefore, that they own is subservient to the king's service or the government service. And by the way, this is, it's interesting political language, from a political theory point of view. We don't think in those terms. We don't consider ourselves to be subjects of a kingdom. But that's essentially what he's writing. And as a subject of the kingdom, we are subservient, and everything that we own is subservient to the government. We're not used to thinking in those terms because we live in a Western democracy. But when you think about it, the government allows us to live here based upon a social contract that is tacit whenever we choose to live in a country. And that social contract is, we will let you, the government says, we will let you live here. We will let you benefit from the goods and services of living in our country, provided that you pay the taxes. There is a clear quid pro quo that is going on. And lefichach, and therefore, kol haschora shemagia mimena hameches mishubedes lamelech. Therefore, any income that a person is able to acquire that is taxable, really, already there's a lien on that money directly to the government. So by my withholding it, it's not that I'm withholding a debt, but I'm actually stealing from the government, because the government already is considered the owner of that income. And it's therefore considered as if it's in the government's possession already. And so my withholding it is an act of thievery. It's not just an act of not paying my debt. And therefore, anyone who withholds taxes from the government or from the king or from a representative of the king is stealing the king's portion or the government's portion, and it's stealing it from the possession of the king or the government. So that is the opinion. That's the first opinion that is brought in this halacha. And you should know that this is brought in Shulchan Aruch as a machlokas between the Mechaber, Rav Yosef Karo, and the Ramah, and Rav Moshe Isserles. So up until now, we've seen a representation of the opinion of the Mechaber. And now we're going to look at the opinion of the Ramah. And the Ramah writes, V'yesh cholkin al zeh. There are those who disagree with this. Umatirin lahavriach hameches afal pi shememuna olav Yisrael ne'eman. And there are those who opine that it is permitted to evade your taxes even when the tax collector, who is the king's representative, is Jewish. Kevin shagova lamelech nochri. Because the tax collector is collecting on behalf of a non-Jewish king or government entity. Ve'im hamemuna yodea b'havrachaso, eno rashai lachufo litain hameches. And if the government representative is aware that his fellow Jew, right, let's say it's a Jewish tax collector, and he's aware that his fellow Jew is evading the taxes, that collector is not permitted himself, according to halacha, to coerce his fellow Jew to pay the tax. Hoil umin hadin yachohu lahavkiya chov hanachri. Since he is acting within his halachic rights to evade the payment of that tax. Now, so this is a very startling statement. It's a very jarring statement. We're going to have to clarify it and see how it applies to a modern government today. Now, remember, the Ramah is living in Poland in the 16th century. The Mechaber is living in Eretz Yisrael in the 16th century. And there may be different perspectives based upon different political realities, but we're going to continue. Now, the im yesh bazeh mishum yiras hamelech yachol lachufo. However, if the tax collector feels that he needs to impose the fear of the king on the subjects, then he is permitted to coerce any Jew who wishes to evade taxes. He's allowed to coerce him. So just to clarify what this means, if we take a look at the Imrei Yaakov over here, Um, so first of all, uh, V'im hamamuna yodea b'havrachasa. Wrote Solomar, im hamoches ha'yisrael yodea mehavrachasa. That if there's a Jewish tax collector, and the Jewish tax collector wants to abide by halacha, and he recognizes that a fellow Jew is evading taxes, he's not allowed to coerce him. However, if he does so mishum yiras hamelech, because of the fear of the king, wrote Solomar, shahamoches ha'yehudi yarei l'nafsho. That means to say that the Jewish tax collector fears for his life, in that Shema Yivada Lamelech Shenasam Lachaber Lahavriach Asamechas V'Yanishenu Alzeh Azmuter Lo Lachov L'Shalem. That the Jewish tax collector turns to his fellow Jew in the shul and he says, "Psst, Yankel, I notice you haven't paid your full taxes this year." And Yankel says, "I know, Moshe, I'm abiding by my halachic rights that I'm allowed to evade payments to the king." But Moshe then says to Yankel, "But Yankel, don't you realize that if you don't pay, the king's going to come after me. He's going to put me in the dungeon. So therefore, I'm going to have to rat you out if you don't pay the tax. I expect a bag of gold coins of drunkats on my doorstep right after Shabbos." Right? You can imagine that kind of scenario in the medieval period. And so therefore, Moshe is acting within his rights to coerce Yaakov to pay, because he says, my head is on the chopping block if you don't pay. So then it is permissible for the Jewish tax collector to coerce his fellow Jew. And then, so now that we have two opinions, the second opinion is the opinion of the Rama, that it is permissible to evade tax payment because he disagrees fundamentally with the depiction that the Machaber has provided. In other words, the second opinion essentially says, no, it's not that the king is the muhzak, is already the possessor of that property that is taxable, or that income that is taxable, but rather it's just owed to the king. And since it's a debt, and the prohibition of lo ta'ashoket re'acha only applies to your fellow Jew, therefore it is permissible to evade taxes. However, v'yirei shamayim yachmir la'atzmo kisvara harishona shelo lavor olos al losase shebatorah. The Rav Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. He says, listen, when you analyze this carefully, you see two very disparate opinions. But the first opinion says that not paying your taxes is a biblical prohibition. It's an Isser Deoraisa of thou shalt not steal. The second opinion is, no, it's okay. So in any area where one opinion says you're committing a biblical violation of stealing, and the other one says you're not, any God-fearing Jew is going to be machmir and not even try to play this game. Okay, V'im Yisrael kana hamechas la'atzmo min hamelech divrei hakol asher lahavriach min haTorah. Now, another scenario that he brings into this, the Rav Shulchan Aruch, is, so let me just point out, let me just see if there's the Imrei Yaakov says, right? He just clarifies that the first opinion says that there's an Aveira of lo tigzol. Now, another scenario would be that the king sells the rights of taxation to different private individuals. Now, this doesn't exist in modern government structures today. The government doesn't sell rights of collection of taxes to different individuals. There's municipalities. Every municipality collects the taxes, right? And they hire people to collect taxes for them. But in the old days, in the medieval world, the king would basically offer for sale rights of tax collection. And the king would basically say every subject within this particular land region has to pay X number of rubles or drunkats per year. but I don't want to be bothered with the hiring someone to do the tax collection for me. So I will sell the rights of collection for what we estimate the population is, and it's up to you to collect it, and you'll make a tidy profit if you wish to purchase it, and you just have to go from door to door to collect the tax, right? And that's where we got the previous discussion in the halacha, where when the tax collector is oppressive because he's collecting far more than what he was entitled to collect, right? But here we're saying that, let's say a Jew purchases the rights of tax collection from the government, okay, and he charges, and he's actually collecting the legitimate amount that has been legalized by the king. So ledivrei hakol asur lahavriach min haTorah shehu shaharei gozel esa Yisrael. Then everyone would agree that if the person who purchased the rights of collection is Jewish, then you're not allowed to evade paying him what is owed in the tax. Aval im kana nachri mutar ledivrei hakol afilu yadua she'eno mosif klum al kitzvas hamelech. But if the person who purchased the rights of collection is a Gentile, then you are allowed to evade, even according to the first opinion. And because in this scenario, you're not evading what you owe to the government, because the government has already been paid for its services and rights and privileges that it provides to its citizenry by selling the rights of collection to this middleman. Shehu muchzak b'mechazeh, ki cheskasuhu machmas gufo shehu melech, v'chol haaretz shelo v'avadav v'chol asher lahem meshubadim lo. So he says, realize that when the king sells rights of tax collection to a middleman, to a third party, he's not selling the royal rights of having a lien on people's property, the way that a king or a government does. All the government is selling to that middleman is rights of collection. And so therefore, by my not paying that middleman, I'm not taking away his lien on my property. Because the subjects of the kingdom only by consensus recognize the government or the king as that entity who has rights over their property. And therefore, all the king can legitimately sell to a third party is rights of collection, but he cannot sell or give over to that third party the status of being a government entity. And that's the reason why even the Mechaber would agree that in that scenario, you are allowed to evade your taxes, provided that there's no Chilul Hashem, as we learned in Sif Dalet. All right, so this is essentially the skeletal framework of the machlokes between the Mechaber and the Ramah, and the language that is found in the Shulchan Aruch is in Simin Shin Samach Tes. And let me just bring that up very. Oops. Simin Shin Samach Tes. If anyone would like to interject at this point, feel free. I'm just bringing up the actual language of the Shulchan Aruch itself so that you can get a better idea. It's also important to note that there still is the principle of dina de malchus dina. So this is the language of the Shulchan Aruch. In Sif Vav and Siman Shin Samach Tes, the Mechaber says that the only time that you're allowed to evade paying taxes is when the tax collector is acting as a robber, like the sheriff of Nottingham, where he's collecting indiscriminately and just takes whatever he can. But if the king has appointed an allotted amount, and the tax collector is collecting that specific amount, the hemid moches Yisrael legavos lamelech, v'noda shadam ze neman ve'no mosif klumo mashe gozer hamelech eno becheskos gazlan b'shum dedina demalchus dina. He says, and if the king appoints even a Jew for this position, then you're not allowed to evade paying your taxes, and you have to abide by dina de malchus dina, by the law of the land. V'lo od el shehamavriach mimechazeh over alo sigzol, ipnei shehu gozel manas hamelech, bein shahaya melech Yisrael, bein shahaya melech oved kochavim. And it doesn't matter whether the king is a Jewish king or a non-Jewish king. V'chenim Yisrael kana hameches mehamelech hamavrich atzma reza gozel Yisrael sheknao. And if the king sells the rights of collection to another Jew, then not paying him is also an act of thievery. Okay, that's something else. And notice that over here he writes, as long as there's no chilul Hashem, then it is permitted to evade paying the third-party tax collector, like we saw at the end. And then here you have the Rama, which is the second opinion. Even though you're not allowed to evade paying taxes because of the dina de malchusa dina, mikol makom imada mavriach ein lamoches lachuf osolitein. But if a Jew evades the payment of that tax, the Jewish tax collector cannot coerce him to pay. So the language of the Rama is slightly different from the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch. The Rav Shulchan Aruch had said it's permissible to evade taxes if the tax collector, according to the Rama, if it's a non-Jewish tax collector on behalf of a non-Jewish king. And he says, however, that's provided that there's no chilul Hashem involved, right? You're not allowed to evade because of dina de malchus dina. And if you do evade it, you are in violation of abiding by the law of the land. But it's just that in the event that a Jew fails to pay his taxes, you're not allowed to coerce him to pay. And this is where we get to this, and I'm going to show you, perhaps next week, I'll show you some more detailed literature on modern day tax evasion, how the posts can come out. But the point being is that the issue is, am I allowed to report a person who's guilty of tax evasion? And if I work for the CRA, am I allowed to do my job and make sure that I audit a person properly and make sure that he pays his taxes? This is where the gray area comes in. Must the Jew pay his taxes? Yes. What is the obligation? Well, it's either because if you don't pay, you're actually committing a biblical violation of Gezeilah, or at the very least, you're in violation of Dina de Malchus Dina by not paying your taxes. Okay? And you're potentially creating a Chilul Hashem if the government finds out, which by creating a Chilul Hashem, that's also a biblical violation. So you have to be able to determine that there's no Chilul Hashem, and for whatever reason, you're not in violation of Dina de Malchus Adina. So that nuance was not so readily apparent in the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, but I wanted to point that out. And in Mirz Hashem next week, we'll talk a little bit more about the whole issue of tax evasion in modern governments. Okay? Any questions, comments? All right. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone. I believe that Monday is the statutory holiday. Did I get that right? It's Victoria Day. And so we're going to commence on Tuesday. All right, everybody? Okay. We'll see you on Tuesday.
Shabbos.
Have a good